Well, good evening, and welcome to all of you to the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at Elizabethtown College, Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Welcome to all of you who are here in person in the Booker Meeting House, as well as to all of you joining us live streamed in the area or across the country. I'm Steve Nault, Interim Director of the Young Center, and so glad each of you could join us this evening. The Young Center's mission is to foster and promote the study of Anabaptist and Pietist movements, historically and today, their development and spread across time and place. And this evening we are considering those latter themes as we look at communication networks and migration patterns in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we do so by welcoming Dr. Rosalind Beiler, the Young Center's Snowden Fellow for 2021. Before introducing Dr. Beiler more formally, I want to acknowledge and thank Lucille Heisey Snowden, whose generous funding of the Snowden Endowment makes possible this fellowship each fall semester. We are indeed indebted to Lucille for making this event possible. To introduce Dr. Rose Beiler, she is Associate Professor of History at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Her research focuses on the German-speaking Atlantic world, as well as the field of public history. She received a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania and has numerous publications to her name. I'll mention her book, Immigrant and Entrepreneur, The Atlantic World of Caspar, Wistar, published by Penn State University Press. Other publications, articles, essays, and things I could mention, many of which look at the intersection of religion and migration in the early modern Atlantic world. She's also the co-editor of Early American Studies, which is the quarterly journal of the McNeil Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Her presentation tonight is drawn from her current research, a book in process tentatively titled Communication Networks and the Dynamics of Migration. And it has a companion digital project that she may be referring to this evening that goes by the acronym PRINT, stands for People, Religion, Information Networks, and Travel. Before we hear from Dr. Beiler, I want to let our live stream audience know that you can submit questions via the Q&A feature of this webinar, not the chat feature, but the Q&A feature. And as time permits during the question time, I will relay those questions to Dr. Beiler. We'll take up those questions, or as many as we can. And of course, those of you here in person should also be thinking of your questions to ask during our question time. Now, let's hear from Dr. Rose Beiler on her topic, Seeking Religious Toleration, Anabaptist Communication Networks and Migration in the 17th Century. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve, and for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the staff as well at the Young Center. Edsel Burge, Kay Wolf, Cynthia Nault, for all of the help and support that they've offered during my fellowship here this fall. It's been a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out to learn about my research. So as Steve mentioned, my presentation tonight is Seeking Religious Toleration, Anabaptist Communication Networks and Migration in the 17th Century. And this is part of a larger book project, and in fact also part of a digital project, which I'm not going to talk very much about tonight in the presentation, but I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards if you have questions during the Q&A section of the session. So the larger book project from which my talk tonight comes is about the communication networks of religious minorities, especially Anabaptist, Quakers, and Pietists, and the ways those networks shaped migration flows in the 17th and 18th century. I'm especially interested in the ways that Anabaptists and Quakers started writing to other like-minded people across political, cultural, and linguistic spheres in their attempts to deal with religious persecution. Dutch Anabaptists communicated with their Swiss brethren who were threatened with exile, and as they did so, they established common ground and regular correspondence. English and Scottish Quakers, who were themselves regularly persecuted, also sought those that they thought were receptive to their understandings of the truth. They began visiting and writing to Mennonites and Pietists in Europe, we're talking about here, and the Pietists were also experiencing harassment in the late 17th century. In the process, these correspondence networks created a kaleidoscope of overlapping and intersecting ecumenical connections. The communication networks that were created to deal with persecution and for conducting missionary work became channels eventually for information about migration. Dutch Anabaptists sent letters, money, and household goods up the Rhine to help Swiss exiles resettle in Palatine villages. Quaker missionary William Penn recruited Anabaptist and Pietist settlers for his colony by sending promotional literature with offers of religious toleration through these same networks. Heads of state who were looking for people to resettle their lands devastated by war did the same. And merchants and other entrepreneurs offered specific information about logistics for mobility. So my book then argues that by the early 1700s, these communication networks that were established for religious reasons, they took on a life of their own as people with different interests began to use them for their own purposes. And in the process, the networks that were established for these religious purposes provided the dynamics for the migration of German-speaking people, and I'm especially interested into the British North American colonies. Many German-speaking peoples in the same time period as those who were coming here went east instead of west. But I'm particularly interested in looking at those who come to British North America. And my argument then is that these networks that were established in the 17th century eventually helped to shift migration flows and helped to provide a new source of immigrants for the British colonies in the 18th century. So that's a quick overview of the larger project, the book-length project. But this evening I want to talk specifically about Anabaptist networks and their evolution. And I'd like to take a closer look at how and why their communication connections emerged. And in particular, I'm really interested in looking at some of the human stories that they reveal. I hope to show that the connections that evolved in response to religious oppression fostered an identity that reached from Zurich in Switzerland to Bern and to Zurich and Bern in Switzerland to Amsterdam and eventually across the Atlantic Ocean, so beyond. Those relationships ultimately created a sense of belonging for both those suffering from harassment and imprisonment and for Anabaptists in different places that experienced various degrees of toleration. The experience of persecution and the martyr stories that emerged from those experiences, I think, provided a key bond for Anabaptists who were participating in the communication networks. And I think the human stories are really one of the things that's very striking to me. Let's see if I can get this to go. Nope. Okay. So we begin in Zurich in 1639. That year, officials in the canton of Zurich arrested Anabaptist Anna Bear Miley, who was still nursing her 14-week-old son. They bound her tightly and led her, along with her husband Martin and his brother Hans Jacob Miley, from their home farm in Tegerist to Zurich. There they stripped the two brothers of their clothes and they took away their belongings. The Mileys were held in Ottenbach, a Dominican cloister the city had recently repurposed as an orphanage and a workhouse. While imprisoned, officials treated the Anabaptists harshly. They deprived them of food and drink, and they placed them in shackles for periods of time, and they forced them to do hard labor. In addition, religious authorities also catechized them, where they taught them, along with other Protestant orphans, children who were kept in the same building. The authorities believed that they could convince the Anabaptists of Orthodox theology by instructing them. While some of her family members were imprisoned for a year, Anna Miley and other Swiss Anabaptist women remained in Ottenbach for 2 years before they were finally freed on the Friday before Easter in 1641. There we go. This was not the first time that the government of Zurich had imprisoned Miley family members. In August of 1613, 26 years earlier, the canton's officials arrested their father, Anabaptist preacher Hans Miley Sr., along with 5 other ministers. During their imprisonment, Zurich's religious leaders questioned Miley Sr. and the other Anabaptist preachers repeatedly. And what you see here is a picture of City Hall and the cathedral, 2 of the places where there would have been hearings of the Anabaptist leaders at the time. They tried to find common ground with the dissenters, that is, the officials did, and they tried to convince them of Reformed orthodoxy. So the Reformed Church was Zurich's official church at the time. But sticking points where they could not reach agreement remained. The Anabaptists believed in baptizing adults. They thought that Christians should not participate in government because doing so required them to swear oaths of allegiance, and they believed the Bible taught them not to swear oaths. They claimed that joining the military to defend their homes was unchristian, and they also refused to attend the Reformed Church, which was required by law of all of Zurich's subjects. And finally, the Anabaptists claimed that nobody had the authority to banish them from the canton. The city's mayor and council found that the Anabaptist beliefs threatened not only the religious order of the day, but also civil order, political order. They maintained that as religious teachers, the men were, and I'm quoting here, so misleading the government's subjects and diverting them from their proper obedience that they sentenced them to 6 years' labor as galley slaves on French ships. After lengthy debates and conversations, 3 of the Anabaptist leaders were released as long as they promised to leave the canton. The other 3, however, were sent to perform 6 years' labor as galley slaves on those ships. But on the way to the ships, they escaped. By the following fall, Hans Landis, one of the escaped leaders, was back in Zurich, preaching and carrying out sacraments among his Anabaptist congregation. After lengthy attempts, once again, to convince him to conform to Reformed orthodoxy, Zurich's Great Council voted to sentence him to death. They claimed he was not being sentenced for his religious beliefs, but for his civil disobedience, that is, for his refusal to obey the government. And this is how they justified his execution. This is, of course, very different from the perspectives of the Anabaptists. Landis was executed on the 29th of September in 1614, and the picture here is the place of execution. There's a plaque there today in Zurich, which you see in the middle photograph. Which you see in the middle photograph. And this is a place in the Limmat River where earlier Anabaptist martyrs had been drowned on a regular basis. Landis's execution, however, failed to accomplish the Great Council's goal, which was to encourage Anabaptists to attend the Reformed Church. Instead, his execution fostered empathy among Zurich's subjects for their Anabaptist neighbors and hostility toward government authority. Following his execution, Protestant religious leaders determined not to use the death penalty or galley slavery as a punishment, except in extreme cases, but rather they favored the use of imprisonment and economic sanctions for future punishments. Now, between Landis's death in 1614 and the 1630s, when the Miley family members were imprisoned, we have little evidence of direct harassment of Zurich's Anabaptist. During the period, Zurich officials faced 3 challenges. First, there was growing and widespread view of Landis as a martyr, especially among Anabaptists in the canton. Secondly, they faced criticism of their treatment of Anabaptists from both inside and outside of Zurich. And third, they also faced a growing determination among the Anabaptists to continue practicing their beliefs while remaining in the canton. Now, certainly, Zurich's officials did not condone Anabaptism, and there's some evidence that they continued to engage in theological debates with the leaders of their congregations. But those imposing punishments or questioning the dissenters were more likely to be local authorities or their neighbors. Zurich's patchwork of legal jurisdictions, what were called Herrschaften, and the sympathy of family members who had not converted to Anabaptism, meant that dissenters could easily slip over the regional boundaries and borders or receive help from family and friends when local conditions became heated. According to historian Barbara Becci-Mautz, the actions following Landis's execution demonstrate that Zurich's officials did not tolerate religious dissent, but they also did practice a form of pragmatic acquiescence, she calls it. That is, it's a form of sort of practical toleration. By the mid-1630s, however, that changed as circumstances changed. The 30 Years' War threatened Zurich's borders, and so when Anabaptists refused to participate in the local watch, civil authorities stepped in. First, in late 1635, officials imprisoned the Anabaptists, several Anabaptist teachers, because they thought that they were responsible for leading their subjects astray, leading their congregations members and other people astray. When hearings and theological disputations failed to convince the teachers of the errors of their ways, authorities began to prepare for economic sanctions. So they converted the Ottenbach cloister. Here it's pictured on the western side of the Limmat River. This is sort of not, it's a depiction that does not depict the city sort of north to south. So on the western side of the Limmat River, they converted the Ottenbach cloister into an orphanage and a workhouse that would suffice for imprisoning the Anabaptists. And they also took a census of all the Anabaptists living in the canton, and they inventoried their property. In 1637, authorities took Miley Sr. and other Anabaptist leaders prisoner again. This time, they held them for 43 weeks in Ottenbach. They tried to convince them to leave, but the preachers responded that their congregations were simply too large. Their congregations included 70 men, 100 women, and 300 children. And furthermore, not all of their family members were Anabaptists. So if they did leave, if they were forced to migrate, that would tear their families apart and create too many hardships for them. Tensions continued to mount and were made worse when 12 Anabaptists, including Miley Sr., broke out of Ottenbach on Easter Monday night in 1638. Officials claimed that the prisoners got the guards drunk and then escaped. The prisoners claimed that they escaped with God's help. By 1639, Zurich's authorities expanded their arrests to include women, who they believed were stirring up the people against the government. One contemporary observed that Anabaptist women spewed out bad and disrespectful speeches against spiritual and worldly leadership, just as much as the men did. These quotes, of course, came from government officials who had a very particular perspective, right? He gave us an example. Annabere Miley, whom he claimed said she does not consider the government to be the children of God, for which reason she does not obey their commands. Margaret Landis supposedly said that she thinks that if she went to the Reformed Church, she would be no more blessed than an insect. And Barbara Brubaker is reported to have said that when she passed a church, it made her want to vomit. Thus it was, in this context, that they took Hans Miley Jr., Martin Miley, and his wife Anna, who was nursing their 14-week-old son Jacob, prisoner in 1639. In addition to expanding their arrests, Zurich's officials also began to confiscate property. By spring of 1640, they had claimed the farms of 40 Anabaptist families in the canton. When they took Hans Miley Sr.'s property at Tegerist in the parish of Stahlekan, His farm supported him and his wife Elizabeth, their son Martin and daughter-in-law Anna, and their 5 young children, their son Hans Jacob and their daughter-in-law Barbara, and their 1-year-old daughter, their 16-year-old son Rudolph, their daughter-in-law Anna Schnabely Miley, the widow of their son Anthony, and the couple's 8-year-old son. So this wasn't a small piece of property. The farm included 2 houses, 30 acres of farmland, 12 acres of woodland, and 33 head of livestock. Miley Sr.'s extended family members petitioned the government for custody of the 7 underage children of those who were imprisoned. And I should also say the couple had 8 children, and so there were 3 of them who had converted to Anabaptism, but the others were still going to church. So Martin Sr.'s extended family members, they petitioned the government for the custody of the 7 underage children of those who were imprisoned. And they also tried to rent the farm so that they could keep the children, the young children, at home and keep the family's property intact. Non-Anabaptist family members pleaded desperately to keep the family together, but to no avail. In May 1640, government officials sold the Miley family farm at auction, which a clerk noted in the record, quote, happened on a beautiful gay spring day, end quote. The property sold for £23,472 after debts and taxes were paid. That's a significant sum of money in the period. The canton's government invested the proceeds from the Miley's property and used the profits to pay for the costs of imprisoning family members. Between 1640 and 1662, so over 22 years, the Anabaptist Commission kept a close account of every expenditure on the family's behalf. And here you can see the annual accounts just for the Miley family. There are other accounts in the archives that are very similar for many of the others whose properties were confiscated. So each year, they noted which family members continued to go to church and who was caring for the underage children in the family when their parents were imprisoned. The government made a tidy profit from confiscating the family's farm. By 1662, 22 years after they sold the property, the clerk recorded profits of £16,626. Accounts of the Miley's confiscated property, like those for the other 46 Anabaptist properties that were confiscated, outlined the dramatic economic loss that they suffered. While Miley's farm might have been significantly more valuable than some of the others that the government seized, Anabaptist families lost their livelihoods. They lost all ability to earn a living or to sustain themselves. Short of imposing punishments by law in body, honor, and property on their non-Anabaptist family members for sheltering or hiding them, their only option was exile. And that, in fact, was what the government was hoping for. Government officials hoped that by depriving them of their homes and the means of making a living, they would be forced to either return to the Reformed Church or to leave the canton. Now, the accounts also tell another family story. And this is the one that was really hard for me to read when I first realized what was happening. Throughout the 1640s, members of the Miley family were repeatedly imprisoned. While their parents were in Ottenbach, the young Miley children, like the children of the other Anabaptist prisoners, were fostered by other families. Zurich officials used the profits from selling the family's farm to pay for their room and board. They also paid for their education and for apprenticeships. We know, for example, that throughout the 1640s, Martin's oldest 2 children with his first wife, Katharina Winch, periodically stayed with their grandparents who were paid to clothe them and send them to school. 2 of Martin and Anna's children were sent to other relatives. And the son who was 14 weeks old and nursing when Anna was first imprisoned in 1639 was fostered first by Martin's sister and brother-in-law, and then by another family. During one imprisonment, Annabelle Miley was pregnant and was held in chains in the hospital until she gave birth to her son. He died a couple of years later. And in between imprisonments, the couple managed to have added yet another daughter to their family. So for these young Anabaptist families, their religious faith led to disruption and separation from parents, children, and siblings. By the time Miley family members fled Zurich in the late 1640s, they had suffered a decade of harassment, imprisonment, separation, insecurity, and homelessness. Meanwhile, news of the Zurich government's treatment of the Anabaptists reached Amsterdam. So in 1639, Johann Jakob Breitinger, who was the Antistus, or the head of the Reformed Church in Zurich, had published a tract justifying the church's treatment of the Anabaptists. Breitinger, who had become the head of the church just prior to Landis's execution, consistently made a case that the Anabaptists were being punished not because of their religious beliefs, but rather because of their civil disobedience. And in a really sort of twisted, bizarre way, he made the case that by punishing the Anabaptists, they were protecting the freedom of conscience for the other subjects in the canton. So he made a case that it was actually preserving religious freedom for everyone else to punish the Anabaptists. When his published justification reached Amsterdam, it set into motion the beginning of regular communication between the Netherlands and Switzerland that centered on ending religious oppression for Swiss Anabaptists. And on this map, you can see Amsterdam to the north and Zurich to the south in Switzerland. The Dutch sought to help the Swiss Anabaptists in two ways. First, materially. They sought to improve the conditions of imprisonment. One of the key people involved in attempts to alleviate oppression was Isaac Hatavier, who was a wealthy merchant who was also a deacon and an elder in the French Reformed Church in Amsterdam. As a member of that church, Hatavier belonged to the French Protestants who had been oppressed for religious beliefs in France and were empathetic to Swiss Anabaptists suffering from persecution at the time. Hatavier had also been in Zurich in 1614 and had witnessed the execution of Hans Landis. 30 years later, he began corresponding regularly with officials in Zurich. In March 1645, he sent funds on behalf of the Dutch Anabaptists from Amsterdam to Switzerland for the relief of those in prison, although it's not clear that the money ever got to the prisoners, because the officials in Zurich claimed that they were actually doing just fine, had lots to eat, and were in good condition. Hatavier continued to correspond regularly in his efforts to assist the Swiss Anabaptists until his death in 1658. The second way that the Dutch sought to help was politically and diplomatically. Dutch Anabaptists sought toleration on behalf of their Swiss brethren. They argued with the Zurich officials against imprisonment and against confiscation of Anabaptist property. Dutch Mennonites used their political connections. Many of them by this point were fairly well-to-do, at least some of them were fairly well-to-do. And they used their political connections to make a case for letting Anabaptists leave the canton with their property intact. For the Dutch, who had enjoyed limited freedom of religion beginning in the 1570s, the longer they experienced toleration, the more they became invested in the stories of the Swiss and their fight against persecution. Regular communication that fostered Dutch assistance with material and political aid also provided Dutch Anabaptist leaders with martyr stories that they used in their attempts to unify their own divided congregations. In September 1645, Jeremias Mangold, a Swiss Anabaptist in Zurich, sent a handwritten report outlining the oppression of the Anabaptists there over the previous decade. 18 years later, in 1658, M. Miley, who's most likely Martin Miley, who I've just been talking about, wrote another personal account of persecution in Zurich. The information from both of those manuscripts were incorporated into Thielman van Bracht's 1660 edition of the Martyr's Mirror that was published in Amsterdam. These reports of oppression arrived as Anabaptist leaders throughout the Netherlands and the northern German states were attempting to breach divides between their congregations. The congregations in these regions were splintered and divided as they sought to determine what each believed to be the true interpretation of the Bible. According to historian David Weaver-Zurcher, van Bracht published his 1660 edition of Martyr's Mirror in conversation with producers of other Dutch martyr books. In contrast to some of them, he included stories from across the spectrum of different Anabaptist communities, not just those from congregations who ascribe to a particular confession of faith. So van Bracht's ecumenical approach signaled his attempt to use martyrdom and these martyr stories to create a common identity among Anabaptists. The stories of martyrs like the Miley family, therefore, provided common ground, a motivation for Anabaptists throughout the Netherlands and the northern German states to come together regardless of their theological differences. In the process, they created a collective memory of persecution that allowed those experiencing toleration to identify with others from different cultural and theological backgrounds. Now, to understand how these stories of persecution crossed cultural, theological, and political borders, we need to look at the structures of the communication networks that evolved over the 17th century. Many of Zurich's Anabaptists who suffered from harassment in the 1640s fled the canton, and like the Miley family, they migrated into Alsace and the Palatinate. So here is Alsace here, and this is being hidden by a message on my machine, but oh, you can't see it at all, can you? Okay, so Alsace is on the left. The Kraichgau, which is in the Palatinate, is on the right. And the Mileys went first to Alsace before joining the Müller family and moving into that Kraichgau region on the right. And the images here, on the right is the house in Steinsfort, where that was an Anabaptist meeting place in the 1650s and 1660s in the Kraichgau. And on the left is an image of the Onenheim Mill, which is actually where the followers of Jacob Ammon and the followers of Hans Reist came together to try to reunify in the late 1600s. In both of these places, Anabaptists managed to obtain limited toleration. They were not full subjects of the principalities in the states where they lived. Instead, they received short-term leases for farms that would often run out and sometimes not be renewed, and different privileges depending on where they were. They often received the right to gather in small groups for private worship, and they often received some sort of release from military duty, many times in return for paying a special tax or a fee. But intolerant local authorities or war would frequently force them to seek other options and to migrate to other places. Meanwhile, in 1670, new measures sent another wave of Anabaptists down the Rhine, this time from the canton of Bern. In 1671, Jacob Everling, an Anabaptist minister from Obersalzen in the Palatinate, sent a letter to the Mennonite congregation in Amsterdam describing the poor condition of the arriving refugees. He reported that many among the exiles were either elderly or young children or those who were sick and infirm. By the following year, a total of 640 Swiss Anabaptists had arrived in communities on both the east and the west sides of the Rhine, where Palatine congregations were helping to establish them in new homes. The exiles posed a heavy burden on their benefactors, who were themselves refugees struggling to survive. In response to Everling's letter, the Dutch Anabaptists collected money, food, clothing, and tools to distribute to the exiles. By the 1670s, the networks, I should say, that were evolving were anchored at both ends of the Rhines. In the Netherlands, a handful of leaders who lobbied governments and solicited information, goods, and money headed the assistance efforts. They formed a committee that met periodically in Amsterdam, and that became known as the Committee for Foreign Need. They also corresponded with Anabaptist leaders, with government officials, and other intellectuals in Switzerland. Now, in this image, the pins that you're seeing identify senders and receivers of letters, and this is the part of my digital project. This is the only place really where I'm showing you a piece of my digital project, which started so that I could do this, so that I would have good illustrations for this book. So the pins here identify senders and receivers of letters, and many of those letters have been published in the 2-volume Documents of Brotherly Love edition that was edited by James Lowry, where the letters were transcribed and translated and edited by James Lowry. And what we see here is that there's a big cluster in Amsterdam, and then they're distributed along the Rhine River, if you know something about the geography here, right? And go all the way to Switzerland. In the Netherlands, church and lay leaders from congregations in Amsterdam solicited money on behalf of the religious refugees. For example, on January 20, 1672, 2 congregations in the city collected coins, a gold chain, a gold ring with a diamond, and several silver medals, which they then sold to provide aid to the exiles. They also requested contributions from other congregations in the region. By 1690, committee leaders solicited financial resources from congregations in more than 30 locations scattered throughout Holland, Zeeland, and Friesland. They coordinated information and kept careful records of the money and the resources that they collected and expended on behalf of the refugees. The committee in Amsterdam also connected to church leaders in the Palatinate through men they sent up the Rhine to assess the needs of the refugees, collect information, and deliver money, letters, and household goods. The committee gave very careful instructions about who to contact, the kinds of information to gather, and how to distribute the funds and supplies. For example, one group sent to the Palatinate in 1672 went with merchants who were traveling to the Frankfurt Fair, which was where a lot of trade happened twice a year, and they used their connections to draw bills of exchange on the merchants there. Then they purchased specific household goods for the refugees that were living along the Rhine or had resettled along the Rhine. After their arrival in the Palatinate, the traveling group drafted detailed accounts of how they spent the funds. They noted, for example, that they delivered 1 mattress and pillow, sheets, textiles for men's clothing, money to have clothes made, women's shoes and socks, and household equipment to Peter Frederick, who was age 66, and his wife, who was the same age, and they were both living at Eichtersheim. So now, while Dutch urban areas functioned as collection points, several cities and towns along the Rhine became important distribution and communication centers. Mennonites in Krefeld, the red circle towards the top, towards the north, acted as a key hub. Mennonites there contributed money and supplies to aid the cause. They also used their merchant networks to assist the exiles. And they passed on information about the refugees in the Palatinate to Dutch Anabaptists. Further up the Rhine in the Palatinate, congregations in Kriegsheim and Mannheim, and that's the lower circled area, were also key nodes in the network. Congregational leaders communicated with Anabaptist preachers and family members in Switzerland and coordinated shelter for the refugees as they arrived. In 1671 and 72, Palatine ministers met in Kriegsheim to construct a census of the exiles, They held church councils there, and they drafted letters there to Amsterdam or to Bern. In both of these places, those who joined the efforts to help refugees had themselves been earlier targets of religious discrimination. And we can talk about this more, if you wish, in the question and answer period. So what we see is that in response to religious persecution and in their efforts to create toleration, European Anabaptists created regular communication networks and shared identities that crossed political, cultural, and linguistic boundaries and stretched from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south. With the founding of Pennsylvania in 1681, those networks extended across the Atlantic. As we probably know, in 1710, a group of Swiss Anabaptists migrated to Pennsylvania and established a congregation at Conestoga, the area that today is around Willow Street, Lampeter, and Strasbourg. There, once again, they settled on land that was claimed by a single proprietor, William Penn, who determined their rights and privileges. As immigrants from outside of the British Empire, they became naturalized as British subjects by Pennsylvania's colonial legislature. And through that naturalization, they were granted the right to purchase land outright and to pass it on to their children. And from William Penn, they received the right of religious toleration. So for 30 years, the community in Conestoga lived in relative economic ease and were able to gather for worship without harassment or persecution. But by the 1740s, threats of war were looming. In 1742, ministers representing the Mennonite congregations of Pennsylvania wrote to Dutch Anabaptists seeking their advice. They acknowledged the help that the Dutch had extended to their parents and their forebears in the past. And they explained that up until that time, they had lived according to their conscience and in peace. But with the conflict looming, they fretted about whether they would be able to continue avoiding military service without threats and harassment. In 1745, Pennsylvania Mennonite leaders wrote again to the Dutch, asking for help this time in translating into German and publishing the Dutch 17th century martyr book, The Martyr's Mirror. Facing potential conflict, they wanted their young people to, quote, have before their eyes the traces of those loyal witnesses of the truth who walked in the way of truth and have given their lives for it, end quote. Now, in 1744, in the midst of these concerns, Martin Miley, dedicated a copy of the Ausbund to the Mennonite congregation at Conestoga. He intended the hymnal to be an inspiration, a potent and tangible reminder that his and his fellow believers' families had survived persecution and that they could do so again if it was necessary. Miley was one of the immigrants who had moved to the colony in 1710 with the assistance of the Dutch. The hymnal he gave to the congregation for its use had been printed 2 years earlier by Christopher Sauer in Germantown, Pennsylvania. And it included an abridged version of Jeremiah Mangold's truthful report of the brothers in Switzerland in the Zurich region, I'm giving you the whole title, because of the tribulations that have befallen them for the sake of the gospel from the 1635th year to the 1645th year. Miley's connections to the stories in this hymnal, in the Ausbund, and to the Martyr's Mirror, the stories in the Martyr's Mirror, were intensely personal. The devoted Mennonite shared his name with Martin Miley, the Swiss Anabaptist who had been imprisoned in Zurich in 1639, along with his wife, Anna Baer, and their 14-week-old son. And coincidentally, the Martin Miley who gave this hymnal to the congregation at the Hans Herr's house was married to a bear. So how's that for sort of symmetry, right? He had inherited a long tradition, evolved over a century, of Anabaptists wandering from place to place, seeking religious toleration and economic security. Martin himself had moved several times, before migrating to Pennsylvania in 1710. The Ausbund he gave to the congregation, adorned on the cover with 2 copper M's, and published the stories of his ancestors, including Hans Miley Sr. and the Martin Miley after whom he was named. And here you can see in the middle picture the segment from Jeremias Mangold's True Report about Hans Miley and his family. Thus, when he inscribed the hymnal that he gave to the congregation at Hans Herr's house as a gift, quote, for the use and benefit of the Most High God, Miley intended it to be an inspiration, a reminder that his family and those of the other congregation members had for generations survived persecution and exile for their refusal to participate in war or swear oaths. He was exhorting them in preparation for remaining steadfast in their beliefs if the colony went to war and required their support. And by the time Martin Miley gave his Ausbund to the congregation at Conestoga, Anabaptists had created a communication network that stretched from Zurich and Bern to Amsterdam and beyond to the British colonies. The connections that they formed evolved in response to religious oppression and in the process of lending assistance to religious refugees, those who were banished from their homelands because of their beliefs. The networks also made possible the flow of information, of money, and material assistance to their fellow believers in need. The relationships the Anabaptists formed also created a sense of belonging for those suffering from harassment and imprisonment, and for Anabaptists in different places who experienced various degrees of toleration that was often fairly precarious. The experience of persecution and the martyr stories that emerged provided key bonds for the Anabaptists who were participating in these networks. The connections in the martyr stories that shaped the common sense of belonging, as we can see from Martin Miley's hymnal, were intensely personal. And I hope that the stories that I've shared with you this evening have given you a sense of the human side of Anabaptist history that I think continues to inform our identity today. So thank you. Okay, and with that, I'm happy to take your questions and try to answer them if I can. Yes, Don?
I had a question about Amish involvement in this, and you use the phrase Anabaptist continuously, which I think in Amsterdam meant Dutch Mennonites, and in the Swiss Brethren. And I realize the Amish story starts later, but I'm curious if any of the records you're referring to relate to the Amish experience as it emerged after 1693.
Yes. So Don's question, I'm going to repeat it. Don's question is that he's curious to know if any of the records that I'm looking at relate to the Amish. So the Amish division forms in 1693, and so he's curious. He noted that I used the term Anabaptist, right? They do, in fact, at times include the Amish. So I've used the term Anabaptists because even in the Netherlands, not all of the Anabaptists considered themselves Mennonites. And so what I've been learning as I've gone further back into the 17th century is that there wasn't a single sort of unifying set of beliefs or a single unifying confession of faith that all Anabaptists shared everywhere. And in fact, part of what is going on in the 17th century is that in the Netherlands and the areas of northern Germany today, Anabaptists are working to try to find places where they can become more united in what they believe, where they're finding shared beliefs. So your question is whether or not the documents refer to the Amish, and they do. They don't always refer to specific groups within the Anabaptists. But when we get into, what I did tonight was to focus on the earliest sort of set of documents that I'm looking at. The letters that inform the networks that I showed here actually span from mostly 1670s up through 1711. I haven't moved much beyond 1711 in my database. And the Amish, after they form their separate congregations in the 1690s, are a part of the conversation. So especially in 1710, as another forced migration is, another group of Anabaptists are being forced out of Bern, there is a lot of conversation from Runkel, Johannes Runkel, who is the diplomat who is trying to help them negotiate their exit, first to stay and then their leaving of Bern. There is some conversation, I wouldn't say a lot, but there is some conversation about the tensions between the groups. In one case, he's finding that they don't, the two groups don't want to ride on the same boats together, they don't want to travel together. So yes, it does include them. I very purposely, I used to try to talk about all of the different groups with different names, and then realized that even as I was doing that, the Swiss brethren were also not unified in Switzerland, right? And so I've now just gone to talking about all of them as Anabaptists, even though there are many different groups throughout. So there is some mention. If you know who is belonging to which group, you can figure out who is who in the letters. And actually, I just have to acknowledge the tremendous work of James Lowry, and now Edsel is continuing that, in transcribing and translating the letters in the Amsterdam archives. I started working in them before he published his volumes, and it's just a pleasure to be able to have the ease of those translations. So if you're interested in learning more, those volumes are a real treasure, and you can find a lot of information in them. Any other questions? Yes, Nick.
I saw on your one print network map that there were two people down in Sicily.
Yes.
What was going on there?
So I believe, I was thinking about that today. So the question from the audience is that on this map, there are two people down in Sicily. And Nick is asking, what is that about? I believe those are likely from 1710 and 11, when once again, some of the Anabaptists from Bern were banished to galley ships. And so this is about negotiating the end of their sentence, if I remember correctly. I'd have to go back and look at the letters to be sure. Sometimes, I will tell you, so I did not start this book project ever assuming that I would do a digital project. And I have started the digital project in my attempt to map the complexity of these networks. So I was having trouble mapping them on a two-dimensional page. And it's not so difficult when I'm just looking at the Anabaptists. But when you start adding the Quakers in and the Pietists in, then it becomes much more complicated to try to illustrate them. And what I really wanted to do was to show change over time. So in all of these networks, they begin corresponding, I don't want to say haphazardly, irregularly, right? And so you begin to see letters going between people irregularly. But as time continues throughout the 18th century, when you start looking at the Anabaptists communicating with one another, the letters are going much more regularly, and they're following more similar patterns, right? But as you put the Quaker letters in there, then the connections between people start to shift. And so it becomes like a kaleidoscope. People are connected by several degrees of separation, and those connections are constantly changing across space and across time. So what we're trying to do, and it's an incredible labor of love, and it's taking way longer than I ever imagined because technology is not easy. What we're trying to do is to take all of the notes that I took and make them conform to a spreadsheet and identify the locations on a map where senders and receivers were, and identify spaces and time, and then run that through social network analysis tools and mapping tools and connect them up. And in my grand plan, if it ever comes to fruition, we will have digitized images of all of the letters that are in the Amsterdam archives or in the Quaker archives or in the Pietist archives in Halle, in a database where researchers can look at them. They will also be transcribed and maybe someday translated because they're in English, Dutch, and German. And you will be able to search for someone by name or search for all of the people who were Quakers. And you'll have an image that comes up that looks something like this. And when you click on one of the buttons, it will take you to the letter so that you can read for yourself the source behind that connection. So that's in my ideal world. We're nowhere close yet, but we're working on it. So, yes, Steve.
So how do the Quakers become involved in this network? So you, of course, outlined the connection that develops between Amsterdam and Switzerland, or up and down the Rhine, and then so how do the Quakers become involved in this network?
Good, that's an excellent question. So Steve asked how the Quakers become involved in this network. So the Quakers become involved in this network because they're really avid missionaries. The Quakers begin in England in the late 1640s, early 1650s. And within a 20-year period, they have sent missionaries literally throughout Europe, throughout Great Britain, throughout the Atlantic world, to the British colonies. They've sent missionaries everywhere. And they're looking for people who they think are, my words, friendly to their understanding of the truth, right? People who they perceive to be like-minded, with whom they share particular beliefs. And that's where they begin. And so they begin to send missionaries to the Netherlands as early as the 1650s, really. And so even as this persecution is happening in Switzerland, and as Amsterdam Mennonites and North German Anabaptists are learning about that persecution, Quaker missionaries are beginning to have conversations with those same congregation members in Amsterdam and in northern Germany. And they start out in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, then they move east. They're in Danzig, they go east into what is today Poland. And they also go up the Rhine. So one of my favorite findings in the library in Karlsruhe, in what is today Baden, is Quaker missionaries posing as wine merchants, getting into disputes with Reformed pastors in Kriegsheim, right? And they, in fact, do convert Mennonites living in Krefeld and in Kriegsheim in the 1660s and in the 1670s. And so that's at the same time that you see these refugees coming up from Switzerland. You can also see Quakers visiting these communities, and they're hearing the stories of persecution. And so William Penn himself travels up the Rhine River in 1671 and in 1677, and then I think again in maybe 1686 with another group of missionaries. One of my favorite Quaker missionaries is Benjamin Furley, who is fluent in 36 languages and acts as a translator. So when these missionaries go into these communities, they don't know Dutch initially, they don't know German. And so they have to find people with whom they can communicate. And Furley is someone who's very gifted in languages, and he publishes and translates and publishes a lot of Quaker literature on behalf of the English and the Dutch Quakers. And he becomes Penn's land agent. And so he's helping Anabaptists and Quakers purchase land in Pennsylvania. He's recruiting them. But he's already been a missionary in these areas, right, where the Swiss Anabaptists are settling. And he begins to correspond with people who are living there, as does Penn. Good question. Yes?
I was wondering whether the connections between the Quakers and the other Anabaptists coming from Europe had to do also with land ownership and William Penn's making land available in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. So the question is about whether the connections between Quakers and Anabaptists have to do with the fact that Penn is making land available in Pennsylvania. And the answer is absolutely. So Quakers, even more so, the Quakers that are converted and are living in the Quakers convert, and the communities and the congregations, the meetings, societies, in the case of Quakers, that evolve in Europe, are suffering from even less toleration than the Anabaptists who have come there. So when the Anabaptists come into the Palatinate, it's different in Krefeld, but in Kriegheim and Mannheim, the elector grants them specific rights and privileges, and then their land, their ability to rent or lease land depends on the local landlord, and that's usually an aristocratic family, right? For the Quakers, they are even more out there than the Anabaptists in terms of what is acceptable behavior and beliefs for Europeans of the Reformed or the Lutheran churches, right? So, so they're tolerated even less so. So they're very much interested in land because they cannot, neither the Anabaptists nor the Quakers who are living in those areas have the ability to own land, certainly not in the 17th century. Eventually in the 18th century, in some places, they're able to own land, but not when Penn is recruiting for his colony. They're not able to own land. And they're also still struggling with religious toleration. Even though they may have it at the highest levels, that doesn't mean their neighbors, that doesn't mean the local pastor of the local church is going to put up with their meetings. So yes, it's very much about land. And when Furley translates Penn's promotional literature into German, specifically for these audiences in the Rhine River Valley, he really highlights religious toleration as one of the benefits that will be offered by the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, unlike other colonies, has no established church. And that's because Penn is interested in offering religious toleration for Quakers and other religious minorities. So most other British colonies have an established church. Pennsylvania does not. And so that's definitely one of the recruiting points. And then land, the availability of land. And so we see for the Conestoga congregation, for instance, that group purchased 10,000 acres of land from Penn early on that they then subdivided among them. So that's a big deal for people who by 1710 generations had not been able to own their own land or to pass it on to their children, and had suffered from that kind of economic loss that we see in the 1640s, and had never really been able to get their feet on the ground economically. It's a good question. Yes? The doctrine of discovery. Could you speak to that? Tell me more what you have in mind. The doctrine of discovery, are we talking about land? Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely talking about land. Okay, so the question is about the doctrine of discovery, right? And I just wanted to make sure I understood where you were going, which doctrine of discovery. So the doctrine of discovery is this European notion at the time that any new lands that you claimed, that you quote unquote discovered, right, belonged to you. So in the case of Pennsylvania, is the case that we're talking about here, where it really fits in. In the case of Pennsylvania, historians have portrayed Penn as someone, William Penn himself, as someone who was very interested in making sure that he had purchased land from the Native Americans he was encountering, the indigenous peoples he was encountering when he came to Pennsylvania. I think that there is some question today about the extent. Certainly his descendants, his sons, were less concerned, greatly less concerned about the purchase of land, right? In the case of Penn, the doctrine, and for the land that's Pennsylvania today, the doctrine of discovery would have preceded Penn, however, because the first Europeans who would have arrived in Pennsylvania would have been the Dutch, and then afterwards the Swedes. And so there were Dutch people living in the area that is now Pennsylvania, along with Swedes, when Penn was granted a charter by the king in 1681 for the land, right? So, so I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question.
Okay, people in this room, there are tons more than I do.
Oh, please, doesn't matter, that's good.
But King Charles,
Yes.
my understanding, he owed money to William Penn's
He did,
father.
yes,
So he said, I'll just give you the pen, but he didn't own the thing. People that have lived here
correct,
from the beginning of time
correct,
and still live here today
yes, yes,
are suffering
yes.
because of all of this.
Absolutely. And yes, you're exactly right. And that was indeed what heads of state were doing, right, in Europe. So Charles had, you're right, absolutely no right to give that land, right? He didn't own it. No, he did not own it. And so you're exactly right. And therefore, the question of whether or not that charter was valid, it was valid from a European perspective. It was not valid at all from an indigenous American perspective, right? And so, you know, in the case of Pennsylvania, like I said, you know, Penn at least tried to be very careful that he had a clear understanding with the first purchases of what the limits were with the people he was engaging with when he arrived, right? And he did not purchase all of the land from the indigenous people for which Charles had granted him the right to purchase, right? Where Charles said, this is all your land. But his descendants certainly were not very judicious in their purchasing of land and in the treaties that they made. Yep. No, and you're exactly right. And that conflict, also the conflict that evolved throughout the 18th century as a result of those land grabs, you know, that created a lot of the conflict that happened during the French and Indian War and before and subsequently. And it really determined who many of the indigenous peoples were, on which side they were fighting during those conflicts. But yes, it goes on. It goes on today. Yes. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Did I understand you correctly when you were speaking of the Miley family, that they were from the village of Zolliken?
Stalikan.
Zolliken.
Yes. So it's Tegurist. Let's see, I can show you here. Let's go back to this slide.
Zolliken is just outside of Zurich.
Stalikan. So it's not Zollikan, it's Stalikan. Here we go. So I actually looked at where Tegurist is, right? So it is on the west side of Zurich and south of Zurich. And this is not a picture of the farm. This is just a picture of another Swiss farm. So the question is, where is the location of the Miley family? And when the property was confiscated, they had lived earlier in Barrettsville, but when the property was confiscated, they were living in Tegurist, which was in the jurisdiction of Stalikan, Stallikon, which is different from Zollikan, Z-O-L-L.
You say originally they were from Barrettsville?
They had lived for a time, no, Biermannsdorf. They had lived in Biermannsdorf for a while.
So it's all on the west side of the lake?
Yes. Yes, in this area, close to where the red arrow goes, close to Tegurist. Biermannsdorf is a little bit to the north, but yes, everything that I found, they were on the west side of the lake.
Question from the
Yes.
virtual audience. Could you talk more about the motivations and personalities involved among non-Anabaptist merchants? Did I hear you say that many of them were instrumental in migration, but not specifically religiously oriented or sympathetic?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, can I talk more about the personalities or the merchants who were involved in helping people to migrate that were not necessarily Anabaptists. So the merchants that were involved in these networks were involved in helping to deal with the logistics of moving people from place to place. So for instance, there was a Daniel Richter. I think I'm remembering his name correctly. I'm just now realizing that I have a colleague who's Daniel Richter, and it might have been Ricken instead of Richter. I might be mixing up names here. But there was a merchant who was from Bern, who was involved in, did somebody say? Ritter, thank you. I knew that didn't seem quite, thank you, Edsel. I knew Richter didn't seem quite right. Okay, Daniel Ritter, who was a merchant in Bern, who by the 1710 migration was the person that city officials, canton officials, put in charge of or hired, or he got the contract to outfit the boats, right? That were going to be taking the Anabaptists who they were banishing from Bern up the Rhine. And so they were not necessarily Anabaptists, right? They were people with their own commercial interests who, in the first attempt the Bern officials wanted to send the Anabaptists up the Rhine, and the first attempt didn't really succeed very well. And then the following year, when they managed to pull it off, they hired Ritter again because of his familiarity with the Rhine River. So the merchants, the ship captains, the people who were involved in the logistics, they were not necessarily Anabaptists. They were doing this as a part of, earning a living, right? Now, Ritter was also involved in a number of exploratory journeys to the British colonies, which I think is one of the reasons why he was a merchant who would have been chosen, somebody who would have been chosen to assist with this particular migration.
Maybe take one more question.
Sure, Elam.
This one ties in with that. This one, we're talking about 1710 communication that was going on from Netherlands down to Bern and Missouri. We're talking about letters and communication. Was there also ambassadors, advocates from the Dutch communities going down to Switzerland and connecting with the political parties?
Yeah, so the question is, in the 1710 migration, 1710 and 11 period, were there also ambassadors who were involved in that communication? And absolutely there was. So one of the things that I found really fascinating is that the Dutch Mennonites by 1710 and 11 are using the diplomatic corps. So they are using, so in 1710 and 11, there is a group of diplomats from various European countries who are meeting constantly at The Hague to negotiate the end of a war. And the Dutch Mennonites are very well connected. In fact, 2 Dutch Mennonite merchants had been involved in a mass migration in 1709 of not Mennonite or Anabaptist, but of German-speaking immigrants that went down the Rhine through Amsterdam to England, and then many of them end up in New York. And in like one summer and fall, something like 13,000 people left the German Rhinelands and what's today Southwest Germany, and migrated through Rotterdam over to London. And there were 2 Dutch Mennonites who had been involved in the Committee for Foreign Need, who oversaw the logistics of shipping that group of emigrants to England. They were very well connected at The Hague with the diplomats who were in the process of negotiating this peace treaty. And so what we see in 1710 and 11 is that Dutch Mennonites are using those same diplomatic connections to find the best possible opportunity for the Swiss exiles in that period. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the paper trail. At one point in the Prussian archives in Berlin, so in the Anabaptist letters, in the documents of brotherly love, there are all of these references to the Prussian king who's making an offer to the Swiss Mennonites, who are the Swiss brethren who are being exiled. And I thought, okay, I want to see the other side of this story. So I went to the Prussian archives in Berlin, and sure enough, there's a whole set of documents titled something like "The Swiss Anabaptist Colony That Never Came to Fruition," something like that, right? And there's a whole set of correspondence that's going through the diplomatic corps from Berlin to Hamburg to Amsterdam, and then down the Rhine, up the Rhine, to Bern. And it's going through diplomats, and Runkel is the diplomat who is in Bern, who's doing the work on the ground in Bern, but there are others in Rotterdam and in The Hague and in Amsterdam and in Hamburg and in Berlin. And they're literally sending their letters with the post of the diplomats by the time we get to 1710. That's not the case necessarily earlier.
No personnel necessarily traveling?
Oh yes, there's also personnel. So you can see like Benedict Breckbill, there are definitely church leaders who are traveling back and forth. And there are, the committees still are very much at work. So it's not all going through the diplomatic corps. These communication networks are still functioning. But you can see how in each place, not necessarily in the Rhine Valley, but you can see how in the major cities, they're connecting up with diplomats, and they're using those diplomats to try to get the best deals. So the 1710 immigrants, 11 immigrants, refugees, they're actually quite picky they have quite a selection of options. And one of the things I find absolutely fascinating is the way that these people who are losing everything actually manage, with the help of their Dutch brothers, they manage to actually have an array of options for resettlement that they choose. So they entertain offers from the Prussian crown, from the Dutch States General, from other Anabaptists in the Netherlands who are going to help them get set up in various places, from the British crown, from William Penn, from the Dukes of Hesse, and someone else along the Rhine. So they have a lot of different options, and they decide not to go to Prussia because they're convinced that the crown only wants the wealthy ones and not the poor ones, and then they hear there's a plague in Prussia, and so they opt not to go there, right? And you can see that news making its way back. So yeah, it's fascinating, I think. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Rose, for sharing with us this evening. We need to wrap our time this evening, but thank you all for joining us this evening. And we'll end this evening by inviting you to look ahead to next semester, next year, 2022, and join us here on Thursday, February 24th for our next event. Dr. Julia Spiker-Kasdorf of Penn State University will be here to introduce the poetry and painting of Jane Rohr and Warren Rohr, Mennonite artists with connections here in Lancaster County and beyond. Special thanks this evening to the staff of Information Technology Services here who made this program possible, and thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center. Good evening, and have safe travels as you leave.